C'est bon. So the mic is on? Yes. I think we'll begin. My name is Barry Moore. I'm from the University of Oklahoma, and I'm here to chair this session. I'm joined by 4 distinguished panel members. Dr. James Baker, Director of Forest and Land Use Measurement of the Clinton Foundation, but also under the Clinton administration, when Mr. Clinton was president, Dr. Baker was the administrator of NOAA, doctorate in oceanography. Matt Applebaum, mayor of the city of Boulder and a resident of that city for over 40 years. Olivier Deschèves, president of EnviroEarth, a marvelous environmental company here in France, and Eric Webster, vice president, general manager, environmental solutions of the Harris Corporation. And we're here to discuss from commitment to verification. You might say, as Mayor Bloomberg of New York has said, if you can't measure it, you can't manage it. So I will serve as moderator. We will begin with each participant, beginning with Dr. Baker, spending 5 to 7 minutes with thoughts about this topic. And then after the 4 panel members have made their presentations, and then we'll have questions and answers and a discussion. I think that this is a very important topic. We all know the one thing about the greenhouse gases, particularly carbon dioxide. We are going to have a problem that is not going away anytime soon. CO2 lasts in the atmosphere for centuries, methane 7 to 9 years, but it is oxidized to CO2. So even though methane only stays in the atmosphere for 7 to 9 years, it's a very strong greenhouse gas, and then its oxidation state takes it back to carbon dioxide. So this is a problem with which we are going to be faced for a long time to come. I'm delighted, though, to begin with Dr. Baker from the Clinton Foundation, previously administrator of NOAA. Jim?
Thank you, Barian. And I'm joined by my colleagues here from the Clinton Foundation, Jesse Gersten and Rob Waterworth, who have been involved in these measurement programs for us. Our focus has been the question of how do you help a country measure its greenhouse gas emissions. And we have focused on the land sector. So if you look at our program, what we've tried to do, working in Kenya with the support of the government of Australia, is to put together a system for monitoring emissions and removals from the land sector that help the country meet all of its reporting requirements. And this is more than just a system that makes technical measurements, but it's one that includes models and data. That's an important piece of it, but also all of the administrative processes so that the country and the government can understand how these measurement systems and the data fit into their policy decisions. Kenya is a very rapidly developing and growing country. There's a lot of development decisions to make, from where do you put the roads, where should the agriculture be, what about reforesting on the 5 big mountains. All of this is critical, and they just moved from having 9 provinces to 47 counties. And so you have 47 new county governors all asking the question, where's the information so that we can do development in the right way? So my third bullet there is a really critical one, that whatever we do has to support the domestic agenda of the country. Otherwise, it's not going to have a high priority. And then in terms of this meeting that we're all attending, this information is very valuable for helping Kenya do its intended national designated contribution for the Framework Convention. So all of this information is critical. Well, what kind of information goes into such a system? It's a combination of all of those things related to development. It's daily weather data. It's crop and plant growth information. It's all the land cover maps.
Your attention, please. We inform you conference, addressing COP21 agreements with actionable information, is now in the plenary. Please join us to hear. Thanks.
Thank you.
Votre attention, nous vous informons que la conférence sur le thème Suivre les accords de la COP21 à partir d'une information concrète se déroule maintenant à la session plénière. S'il vous plaît, rejoignez-nous. Merci.
Merci, Madame. So, we have a set of components that are essential for any system like this to actually work and to be accepted by the government. And it has essentially 3 parts. So one way you have a database, you have modeling, and then you have your integration, basically a GIS system that then provides the information that you need. So on the one hand, it's data coming in. The data is transformed with models, and the models then take the information and put it into a GIS system that then provides the maps that you need. Very much like weather forecasting, whether you have weather data, a weather model, and then a GIS system that makes the maps and provides the decision support tools that are critical. And it's all of these pieces that are necessary if, in fact, we can get the governments to really make a difference. The big issue that we face, and really a bottom line for what I wanted to say, is the following: that climate change competes with other issues when countries make decisions about what their priorities are. Food, water, and health, unemployment, education, refugees, building infrastructure. All developing countries have these issues, and these are pressing issues. And if, in fact, we want to build monitoring and measurement systems that countries will accept, they have to also meet the development needs of a country. So here's the things that we have learned. In order to make a monitoring system work, there have to be strong foundations within the country. You have to identify what data is available and how to fill the gaps, and you have to define that term available, because sometimes data is available to one group but not so obviously to another. And we look very closely at this question of reducing transaction costs by making generic tools. This is we do a lot of work that is all open source software. We've been working with the Linux Foundation to make sure that we have a governable system of open source software. And this making generic systems available means that you don't have different groups trying to do the same thing. They can all use the same tools. So the bottom line there is that MRV systems in developing countries can be developed, but they have to be designed to support broad development interventions. I think we have, let me just go back. Yeah, so that just to emphasize that last point, that unless the systems that are built meet the development priorities of a country, it's very hard to make progress. And I think that's something we find, and I think that's true in cities and in the other areas that we'll be discussing today. So that's my main set of points, and finish up.
Thank you, Dr. Baker. We're going to now switch to a mayor of a small city in the eastern slopes of the Rocky Mountains in the United States, Matt Applebaum from the city of Boulder, Colorado. Matt?
Thank you. So, a little different perspective from a city. And Boulder is not exactly the most typical city. We are pretty well known for our efforts in sustainability and energy efficiency and our climate commitment. We're lucky we have a population that's extremely supportive of our activities. In fact, we have a huge NOAA facility in Boulder. We probably have the largest number of climate scientists of any place on the planet. And so we don't really have battles in Boulder over whether climate change is happening or not. That just doesn't exist. We also have the luxury of having a staff, a sustainability staff. So my message is that our problem isn't so much measurement, although that is an issue. It's what type of information helps you formulate policy. So in the measurement world, we do ascribe to the various international protocols. We do try to measure our greenhouse gas emissions. I suspect, and I'm no expert on this, I suspect we have the same problems everybody has, and that some things are relatively easy to measure. We know our electrical energy usage more or less. We know our natural gas usage more or less. Most of our greenhouse gas emissions in Boulder actually come from electric energy. We unfortunately get our power from a utility company that is mostly coal-based power generation. So although Boulder likes to proclaim itself as being very progressive in many ways in these issues, and we are, our greenhouse gas emissions are actually rather high because of where our electric power comes from. We no doubt have the same issues that everybody does in terms of measuring greenhouse gas emissions that are kind of more indirect, whether they come from transportation or from consumer goods, manufactured goods. I've never been quite clear on how you measure that. But okay, let's say you can measure all of that. And we can talk more about that later, and maybe we will. The question is, what helps you set policy? What helps you formulate, if you're at a city level, what helps you actually formulate policy? And the answer is not just some aggregate amount of greenhouse gas emissions. You really need to know what sectors it's coming from and what's causing it. And so, for instance, in the electricity sector, yes, we could say that 70% of our greenhouse gas emissions come from electricity usage, but we don't control the power sources. At least we don't at the moment. We are actually trying to create a municipal electric utility in order to control just that. Long story, separate issue. But at the moment, we have no control over that. So from a policy formulation perspective, that is not the most interesting piece of information, because there isn't much we can do about it at the moment. Now, we can certainly try to help people reduce their energy usage, and we do that. We have any number of programs. We have basically some of the strictest building codes anywhere in the world. We've got great programs to either encourage or require energy efficiency. But again, we can't really go back to the source problem. And the other thing I would say in terms of policy formulation, and I'll just end it at this quickly, and again, maybe we can have more discussion on this, is that whatever measurement methodology you pick, it has to lead you to the right types of policies in the first place. And I'm not so sure our methodologies do that, because we do seem to focus on just totals as opposed to what's causing it and what are the alternatives. So I'll give you a couple of examples that I give to other people, and they're all incredibly obvious, except somehow we don't deal with them very well. So here's one that's an only in Boulder example, so I can make fun of Boulder, certainly. Google already has a presence in Boulder, but they are building a much bigger campus in Boulder. Most cities would, of course, die to have Google. In Boulder, it's a giant battle as to whether we want Google or not. At any rate, they're going to build this campus. And one of the things that people said who were opposed to Google building a larger campus in Boulder is, well, our greenhouse gas emissions would go up, right? More people, more jobs, higher greenhouse gas emissions. Okay, well, that's arguably true, but of course that's grossly simplistic, because if they don't come to Boulder, they're going to go somewhere, right? Just because they're not in Boulder doesn't mean they get vaporized. They go somewhere. And in Google's case, where would they have gone? Well, they would have gone down the road into a more suburban location. And in that suburban location, because of lack of transit and good transportation options, which they will have in Boulder, in fact, you could argue that they would have caused more greenhouse gas emissions. But we don't look at it that way. We don't measure it that way. I'm not aware of any methodology that says, well, you're not just measuring the total. What you're really interested in is, if you didn't do something, what would the alternative be? And would it be worse or better? Not just within your city boundaries, but regionally or nationally. I think that's a serious problem with the way we measure things. I'll give you one other example just to kind of along the same concept. We have a huge IBM facility in Boulder. They've been there forever, and now they have a very large data center in Boulder. And about 5 or 6 or 7 years ago, I can't remember when, they built a new state-of-the-art green low-energy data center. Great thing, right? I mean, that's what you want them to build. And in doing so, I'm not sure if this is true, but for sake of argument, let's assume they shut down a energy hog data center somewhere else in the United States, not in Boulder, but another facility in the United States. That all seems good, right? Everybody would agree this is a good thing. Guess what? The way we measure, it would be a bad thing. Because the way we measure, there's a new data center in Boulder, it uses energy, which means we have more greenhouse gas emissions. That's bad. Because we don't look at the bigger picture. We don't look at what really happened on a regional or national scale, and the net, of course, is good. To me, those are flaws in our methodologies, because it's not just the science of measurement. This is important. I mean, I don't want to diminish at all the issue that's really before us of how do you measure greenhouse gas emissions, how do you use technology to measure it. This is all extremely important. What are the techniques you use? How do you capture transportation? How do you capture manufactured goods? Good stuff. But from where I'm sitting at the local policy level, the question is, what do you do with the information? How do you formulate policy? And what I think is, in order to formulate good policy, you have to go beyond just the numbers, and you have to understand what the causes are, what the alternatives are, and look bigger picture. Because if all you're doing is looking within your corporate boundaries, which is what we unfortunately tend to do, you know, it's a race. Did my city reduce emissions more than your city? If you're not basing it on some other measurements, whether it's population or economic output, or if you didn't do it here but did it somewhere else, would that be better or worse? And these are all very difficult. But if you're not doing that, I'm not sure how you really are led into making good policy decisions. And to me, that's the local perspective. It's not just as simple as, here's our greenhouse gas emissions. If we cut them by 5% or 10% or 20%, you know, we get a gold star. If only it were that simple. That is certainly a goal, but that is only one piece of the local puzzle. So that's what I'll leave you with, is kind of food for thought about how do we turn measurement technology and methodology into ways to really help localities make good policy decisions.
Before going to the next speaker, I just had to think of some points that Matt just raised I think are very important. And they relate to actually what Jim Baker was saying in terms of the work in Kenya on forest cover. We know coming out of Kyoto that one of the important questions in terms of terrestrial carbon storage was, could you establish that this would be a change in the terrestrial carbon storage because of human actions? Or was it just something that would have happened anyway? In other words, if you're going to actually make a change, if you're going to get credit for something, then can you actually establish that there is a delta associated with human action? And so when Matt is saying that we know these things are happening, but what would have happened had we not done something? There's another aspect of that in terms of also the system boundary. If you have an electric car in California, that should be a good thing. And then you come home and you plug in your electric car to be recharged, and it is being recharged with power from a coal-fired power station in the neighboring state. So in terms of California emissions, the emissions go down. But in terms of US emissions, the emissions may not have gone down. I think these are very interesting comments, both between from a small city and then from a perspective of Kenya and a country. The last two speakers, particularly beginning with Olivier, I was actually engaged in this idea to try to establish a measurement system for the city of Paris. And to think back to a TV series, I thought of the term Mission Impossible. And we actually began work on this about 9 months ago to actually establish a measurement system using lasers from 2 tall towers in Paris, shining across Paris, to begin to get a footprint of CO2 emissions from Paris. And that is actually operating now. So I'd like to welcome Olivier Deschamps as a successful Mission Impossible. So Olivier.
Bonjour to everyone. Thank you very much for this introduction, and I would like to thank you also, Aris, for this invitation and for the quality of the collaboration that we have developed since beginning of the years. Effectively, Aris has been in touch with the LSCE, the French National Laboratory for Science and Climate in France, for which we are already working for installing a certain number of equipment, including point CO2 monitoring. And then, well, we started this collaboration and accepted this more or less impossible, but finally we were quite successful to install the system in Paris. I will come back to that. So just to present you the company, Envireurs is part of a small group, engineering group, Enviro Group, and we are familiar with, of course, installation of equipment and monitoring, environmental monitoring system and observatory monitoring system, I would say worldwide, including in very isolated site. And the challenge for that time was to install in a urban area, so it was a new challenge for us as well. And we are also familiar with the consulting division that we have with the carbon inventory. So we know particularly well where we are talking about, also regarding the carbon footprint and the methodology that we are using. We work also in renewable energy and in different, with different customers like United Nations, CEA, and of course LSC. The challenge that we have to install the system in Paris, and I'm sure that Eric from Aris will describe a bit more the unit, was a bit challenging. For why? Because in fact the unit is based on 2 laser emitters that we have to place in altitude, and we have, after different research, find 2 operating I would say real estate companies, and I mentioned here Paris Habitat, Elogi, ICAD, which were very useful for us, which are managing different real estate in Paris. And we have to install 15 retro reflectors of this laser beam. And it was a very big challenge in terms of authorization, in terms of course, installation. Well, I will go fast on that because I would like to go in the real subject. Today it's working, and the first information after a few days of measurement, few weeks now, is that we are very happy with the system. The confirmation that first, the green light system, which is the name, is very reliable, easy to install. It's challenging to install, but when we have the system on site, it was not so difficult to reach the good line alignment, etc. It was very well designed, very interesting. It's really the field point of view of our engineers. And today, what is interesting is that we are measuring something that the meteorological organization, worldwide organization, was expecting to arrive for this year, for this end of this year, effectively, we have an average of more than 400 ppm CO2 in the atmosphere. And what is very interesting as well, and we were discussing that just before, we can see a very high variability in the measurement. So we see, of course, the daily and with the night, which is, of course, a very high potentially difference. We see during the day evolution according to the activity, and we see also potentially variation according weather or whatever, and we see emitters. One example is the first day of the COP21. As for the Parisian people, they were very upset because they cannot take their cars. All the big delegation was there. And so we see particularly well on this 30th of November a low emissions because effectively we have a very low traffic. But we see, by the way, and by difference, we could really see the emitters, like the urban, we say chauffage urbain, you know, the urban heating system, sorry, or the incinerators. So it was very interesting. And as you can see on the system, the way is tomorrow and now we can not only measure an average, but we can see what are the average or what is the peak in a district, in a perimeter. The line you have around Paris is 5 kilometers. So the emitters we have, this is the radius you see, is around 5 kilometers. So you see, we are covering more than 1/30 of the surface of Paris with this double unit. So it's very, very interesting. So what is the next question? We have now a very interesting unit which is completing what existing in terms of point monitoring. And what is the challenge? I just mentioned here what the Price Nobel of Economics, Jean Tirole, which is a French guy, just expressed during the first day of the COP21. A price system is the best economic tool to reduce greenhouse gas emissions, whatever via a carbon tax, what the COP21 will decide or what direction the COP21 will give to go through this type of carbon tax, or via a system of tradable emission, right to the market. We have that with some pollutants. We had with Kyoto Protocol in Europe this tradable emission. We know that it has been to be performed, and we need to give a real and global price to carbon. This is one of the COP21 just in front, potential decision. And we know also that what he says that we will be more efficient for cities, for enterprise, to act by price and by the market. Of course, this is an economics, but we are quite convinced of that, than by regulation or by bans. This is a key point as well. And so what will be the evolution in that context of the carbon verification system and methodology? What has been mentioned is very true. Today, we have carbon tool for monitoring, for counting as well. What we are using mostly for cities, for enterprise, for organization, and even by regulation is emission inventory calculations. And we are very dependent of emission factors that we give for activity, for process, for materials, but which have an uncertainty which are from 5 to up to 50% and could be more. In our experience of consulting, we have, for example, transposed the French methodology or European methodology of emission inventory to Brazil, to 2 states of Brazil. We have done that in Vietnam, and we are actually doing that in Morocco and Tunisia. We know that this uncertainty, when you have to transpose this factor of emissions, you have to you have to make compromise, and sometimes big compromise, because it takes a lot of times. Sometimes you have not the data, so you arrive to a certain big uncertainty. So another question is how to control over time the evolution of an emission reduction plan. As soon as you have your emission inventory, you like to go for action. I was discussing this morning with a large French company. We met Aris as well. And this lady was very interesting. She said, well, we have done so much. This is a company which is investing a lot, not in greenwashing, really in reduction of their gas emission. It is a large cosmetic, if you see the name, a large cosmetic enterprise, very worldwide renowned. They have invested a lot. She said, how I can control, how I can see the evolution of my policy, how I can convince my president, my committee, to say that all this investment was really useful for a reduction, and a reduction that I can measure. And tomorrow, this measurement will probably be also a question of tax. So we see how the question is important. So I try also to compare to what's happening with the air pollution, what we call the criteria and hazardous pollutants, which are regulated, mainly worldwide regulation, whatever the US EPA, the EU directives, even in China, Japan, everywhere. All this has been done through taxation, through stack emissions. So at this stage, the data that we are producing now in Paris with the green light ARISCOP system are really interesting the scientists. We are, of course, talking about with LSC, with LATMOS, and some other scientists are now very interesting, because they probably would like to improve knowledge on the GHG and combine and contribute to whatever about how they can manage and improve their model. So today also another problems that we have to find to face on this new type of calculation and monitoring, that the CO2 or CHG are expressed in tons. In the inventory today, you say that my carbon footprint of my company is a certain number of tons of CO2. Everyone knows that. But to be more precise on a perimeter of city, enterprise, organization, could it be really realistic to implement a taxation index which is based on equivalent CO2 in ppm, like we are doing for other pollutants, for other criteria pollutants? So this is one of the questions. If we go, of course, more in the techniques, I have not the solutions. We are really pragmatic engineers trying to install systems, but we have to work with the scientists to go further, and probably combination between inventory, models, and the measurement will be part of the solution. So this is what we have to really look for, what this system will become tomorrow. Thank you for your attention.
Before going to the final speaker, Eric Webster from Harris, I just want to think aloud with you as we get ready for questions and answers. We know that cities worldwide emit about 70 to 80% of the greenhouse gases. So if worldwide you could have a consistent measurement system worldwide for all of the major cities, then we would have, in some sense, a network of laboratories where we could evaluate what policies are really leading to change in greenhouse gas emissions. because you would have a sufficiently large sample where you're making essentially the same measurement everywhere. I think that is something also that we ought to begin to give serious consideration to. But before going into that, let's go to Eric Webster from the Harris Company, which was the key partner in Greenlight.
Thanks, Marion, and thanks all of you for coming out. You mentioned earlier about Mission Impossible in terms of getting the sensors and the reflectors on buildings. It's also a mini Mission Impossible to always go last on a panel and everybody else says everything that you wanted to say beforehand. So bear with me on some of this stuff from that perspective. But I think from the world of observations, you know, going all the way back to the first kind of CO2 measurements in 1958 with Dr. Keeling and others, there's been a tremendous increase in capabilities. There's space assets, there's airborne assets, there's ground assets. But as we know, the Earth is an extremely large and very complex system. And we try to use models to simulate what's happening, but the models aren't capable without good data and information that goes in them at a temporal and spatial resolution that really helps define what's actually happening versus a simulation of what we think is happening based on that model. Part of the challenge is there's many different groups, even just some of the stakeholders and folks we mentioned on the slide. There's different groups with different missions, different science agendas, different capabilities, and the data and information doesn't overlap very well, right? So I think one of the big challenges for the community is how do we incorporate this data and information in a way that's useful to everybody, given the different needs that everyone has, right? As Dr. Baker had said, and Mr. Applebaum had said, and others, it's kind of a struggle from a business or an innovative standpoint to create the capabilities and needs of serving all these different customers, if you will. But most folks probably don't realize there's less than 5,000 in situ measurements globally for CO2, right? We talk about the Mauna Loas and the Keatings and those, but between the major flux nets and all the other systems, less than 5,000 globally. It's a pretty low number. There's few airborne campaigns, although we've been part of some with NASA, and there's others in Europe and other places. They're sporadic and, again, very specific to a science mission need, not to a global understanding of what's actually happening. And even with satellite sensors, which now can cover the globe, they're just starting to understand what the needs are, right, and how to solve some of these problems. So, as it was mentioned, we rely on inventories, right, to fill in all these gaps and as the basis for decision makers or policy based on how much fuel we burn, not based on actual observations. So I do hope that one of the goals coming out of COP21 is some better understanding of monitoring, reporting, and verification. What are those requirements and those needs, whether it's for an international treaty or a local city or a regional plan? How do we combine capabilities and understandings with needs and come up with better data and information that's actionable for folks at all those different levels? I think there's still a need for a comprehensive plan that's kind of well thought out and working together on the goal of fusing the data and information to actually creating something that somebody could use, right? So it's a big challenge. As we've talked about, one area where we've been spending some time and effort was working on a LiDAR laser capability to measure CO2 and methane at much more accurate levels for temporal and spatial resolution than most other sensors. It actually started about 10 years ago working with NASA for a space mission that we're still waiting for. So that gives you how long of a scale it takes NASA and some of the bigger agencies to deal with some of these issues. But we challenged our team and our researchers and scientists, and we came up with a method to take that. It was an airborne capability that we were trying to scale to space, and we actually brought it to the ground. And we separated the transmitters and the receivers and used reflectors to get a much higher density measurement that can be done in a real time and an autonomous way. We partnered with AER out of the United States for algorithms and atmospheric science, so you actually get a two-dimensional tomographical map of what's happening right now. You can see it, you can understand it, you can see where the winds are coming from, you can see where there's sources, so to speak, and sinks in the sense of where the CO2 is moving. We had a nice partnership with the U.S. Department of Energy to look at carbon sequestration sites, as well as the idea of if we're going to have pushing carbon into geological sites for sequestration, you want to be able to measure and monitor those in real time and understand if there's a leak and what's happening. An inventory or even an in situ measurement won't give you that real-time feedback that you need. We then got a partnership with the United States Department of Commerce and NIST and NOAA, and we expanded our system from a 1 kilometer capability to a 5 kilometer capability, and actually worked in the city of Boulder to measure with some of the scientists there that were looking at, again, this type of system and what it can provide in real time versus what they're getting today from in situ measurements. And then with a little more support internally from our company, we developed and made the system about 25 square kilometers. So working with Enviro Earth and LSCE and other partners here in Paris, which have been great, we actually can show you, hopefully, does it, the map on the lower right shows you in the middle it's blue, which would show you 400 parts per million. The two dots on the bottom with the lines, those are actually the lasers that then hit the reflectors. The map updates every couple of minutes to give you what the measurement is. When we did this snapshot, it was 408 parts per, 408.7 parts per million. On the upper scale there, on the top part, was supposed to be a movie that would run from information we took or data we took last week. It actually was a lot more red and yellow than that current picture is of blue. And for almost a 24-hour period, there were measurements up to the 540 parts per million. So again, I think it would probably shock people to think that Paris and significant parts of Paris were well above 500 parts per million for an elongated period of time. It wasn't it happened for 10 seconds or 10 minutes. It was over multiple hours. So for that 24-hour period, I think the average was closer to 460 rather than the normal 400. Now, with that data and information, now we can start to work backwards and say, well, what happened? Why did it go to 540 parts per million? What was going on in those areas? So you're starting to get some kinds of actionable information that people can use and utilize to determine how to make better decisions or how to better understand what's actually happening in their city. As Dr. Moore suggested, some kind of system in different cities would really give a balance to verify and monitor what's going on and make it more equitable, right, to understand. Dr. Baker also mentioned that climate monitoring is very similar to weather monitoring. I think that the difference is we're still about 20 years behind where we are with weather monitoring. Weather forecasts and numerical weather prediction models utilize satellites, airborne sensors, weather balloons, ground-based radar to give people actionable information on a daily basis. Do I take my umbrella? Is it going to snow? What's going to happen? When it comes to climate and all the different variables, I think we still don't utilize or have the ability to utilize satellite data, airborne data, and ground-based data. The observations are still too sparse. So I think, again, as we hurry up to try to catch where we are with weather capabilities, that understanding of what those needs are to fill in those gaps within the models, to better understand where inventories could be wrong or underestimated or even overestimated. So I think the goal is to develop an understanding, not just to solve one science problem, but to solve capability needs for actionable information, whether it's for the city of Paris or the country of France or a hemisphere or bigger global problems, right? There needs to be information that can be dealt with globally, regionally, and locally. And right now, the systems aren't able to or capable of doing that. So I think that's one of the goals. Hopefully, coming out of COP21, there'll be a little bit more understanding of what some of those needs are, maybe some more agreements, so that folks can develop the systems and a combination or a fusing of the data to actually get you information that you need. So again, I think what we've been able to prove as a group is, a city like Paris could fluctuate to a point of 540 parts per million for a significant period. That's pretty significant. That's not something you'd get from just in situ measurements or inventories. Now the question is, what do we do with that data, and how do we utilize it to make some better decisions or better understandings of what's happening in Paris? So, thank you.
Before we go to questions, I'd like just to comment about an aspect of this measurement. It is in part to measure the concentration over the city of Paris and look at changes. But what one is really interested in are emissions. If 70% of greenhouse gas emissions are coming from cities, we need to understand not just the concentration of the atmosphere, but we need to go to actually what are the emissions. Because what we're interested in as a planet is to begin to stabilize the concentration in the atmosphere. That's the goal. You do not achieve that goal by stabilizing emissions. Stabilization of emissions leads to a constant increase of greenhouse gases, particularly carbon dioxide, in the atmosphere. So what we all know is that there has to be a substantial reduction in CO2 emissions in order to stabilize the concentration in the atmosphere. So what we need to be able to do is to reduce the large areas of emissions, namely the cities of the world. And we need to have a way of measuring that and establish that we're doing it. So this is the real challenge, and that is why some form of measurement system is going to be absolutely essential. So before going to questions and answers, I think that it would be useful if there are any, we have the microphones here. If we could, everyone grab a microphone, please. And I think the one thing that it'd be useful to think back is Dr. Baker talked about the fact that in his work with Clinton Foundation and in Kenya, they are looking for shall we say, a system of systems. A system that actually not only gets at the questions, the scientific questions of carbon storage through reforestation, but also how you actually turn that into reporting mechanisms, and then that you have essentially some long-term verification system. So I'd like to go back to Jim Baker and say, Jim, how is it actually working? Is this strategy something that is beginning to work in Kenya? And can you see that system of systems being able to migrate to other areas of the world so that we can perhaps, in this case, we're not necessarily reducing emissions, but we're increasing sinks for carbon dioxide. Could you comment a little bit more on that? We need help on the microphones. I think they're okay.
Microphone is on?
Yep.
Yeah. Okay. Just a quick word about what Barian said. I think one of the key elements of the COP21 are the individual or intended national designated contributions by countries about how they will mitigate CO2 emissions. But they can't do that without the measurements. And what we've been doing and what others have been doing in terms of monitoring is exactly what those countries need to do that. We've worked in Indonesia to help them do that, and we've worked in Kenya, and we're working in some other countries. And the key element of making that happen is, as I mentioned, is having these generic tools that allow countries to simply adopt a system and then make the measurement without having to start over again. So it's really critical to see how that can happen. And yes, there has been a lot of interest in doing that. But I think one of the really interesting points in the whole discussion was by Mayor Applebaum, who was asking this question about if Google builds a facility in Boulder, does that increase CO2 emissions, and trying to take the longer view, what does it really mean in a broader context? And to me, that's the really big issue. How do you look at things in a broader context so you can make the right public policy decision? So I think that was exactly on point.
Matt, would you comment a little bit more on that? As you see what is being done here in Paris, and I realize that Boulder is a much smaller city, and therefore the footprint is not so important. But as you would say, if you were the mayor of Paris, how would you begin to attack the problem of knowing about are your policies effective or not? I mean, you may want to run for mayor of Paris, but
I'll take a crack at that. I don't speak enough French to be the mayor of Paris, I'm sure. It would be kind of embarrassing. I don't really know how to answer that on the big scale, although I would think some of my concerns would be the same in Paris, where you do need to look outside of just the artificial city boundaries. Right. I mean, measurement is really important, and don't get me wrong. I think we'll learn a lot from measurements even within the city boundaries. We'll probably find sources of carbon and amounts that might surprise us. It would certainly help us determine if we are accurately calculating in various ways, or if our assumptions and calculations and multipliers are just completely wrong. All of that is really important. But get back to policy again. I'll get back to Boulder, I suppose. Paris may have the same issue. If you measure the amount of greenhouse gas emissions from Boulder, you'll miss most of them because, again, our electrical energy comes from power plants that are nowhere near the city of Boulder. And they're spewing carbon into the atmosphere totally elsewhere, as if they're disconnected from us. But of course, they're not disconnected from us. That's the problem. And you'd miss much of the transport problem. Boulder, even though it's a small city, we have a huge number of in-commuters because we're an employment center. Now, you'd measure that greenhouse gas emissions once they hit the city boundary, but of course you wouldn't be measuring the entirety of their trip. How you allocate that's another problem, but you wouldn't be measuring it. And I'm sure that's a problem in Paris too. People come in from outside. So to me, the measurement is part of it, but it's really, again, the causes of it. What can you do as a city? Countries are a little different, but as a city, what can you do? And then, again, the big problem is, as you formulate policy, how do you compare doing one thing with doing another thing, or putting something in your city and having it go somewhere else? How do you capture all of that? And maybe that's too complicated for right now, but I do think that it is really important, because I think a piece of the puzzle, namely the focusing on emissions themselves, sure, that drives you to do things like better building codes, right? More energy efficiency. Yes, eventually getting people into electric cars once they're getting the electricity from renewable sources. All of that is absolutely spot on, the right thing to do. But the bigger picture of how do cities develop, what are their land uses, what are their transportation patterns, what are their employment patterns, how do you decide where things go? That is not just a measurement problem. That's a much bigger issue of, cause and effect, and doing something here versus doing something there. And I don't think we know how to capture that yet, whether we're a small city or a big city for that matter.
One thing, it would have been interesting to have had the green light system in London or in Rome prior to the decision to close off large sections of those cities to automobiles, so that you would have had a pre-policy decision to see what the data looked like. And then there's a large decision to close off large sections of the city to automobile traffic. What did that do to greenhouse gas emissions? I mean, we could conjecture, but I don't think we know.
No, although I assume you can make some estimates using vehicle miles traveled and things like that. And we do the same thing, right? Although some of these multipliers are, as was pointed out, there's a lot of wiggle room in the multipliers. And that also troubles me. I mean, if your goal, at least your short-term goal, for instance, is to reduce greenhouse gas emissions, let's say by 20%, but we know our measurements and our multipliers are within 5 to 50% of being accurate, how do you know if you've accomplished 20% or not, right? It's easily within the margin of error of your ability to measure. And so that too is a bit of a problem. I always come back, I'm a policy guy, I always come back to the policies. The measurements are important. They help you understand, are you attaining your goals? And again, at a country level, they're absolutely essential. But down at the little city level, it's really about the policies and about how you're going to accomplish your next step. And some of that is really easy. If we could get more of our energy from renewable sources, we know immediately that's reducing greenhouse gases, right? We don't have to be really smart about the measurement. We know instantly that's the right thing to do. We know immediately if we had electric cars and they were getting their energy from renewable sources, no question that would be a good policy outcome. So there are things like that where you understand the policies and the measurements presumably would validate what you're doing. But some of these policies takes a long time to kick in. That's the other problem. And if we're looking for really quick fixes and really quick changes, sometimes you don't take the right policy choices that are much longer term to play out.
Before going to questions from the audience, so be thinking of some, I want to go back to Olivier. You've had experience in some of these measurement systems in other places of the world. Based upon that, as you look to the next 10 years, and you could actually have one wish, how would that wish play out in terms of what kind of systems do we need and what could we actually achieve in terms of trying to really get an understanding of greenhouse gas emissions?
It's a difficult question, but nothing impossible, as you say. No, what we see is that effectively in US, in France, in Japan, in Europe, we have a lot of tools. We are trying to know if the tools regarding what we have is enough precise. It was interesting what you said, because we are talking about also the carbon footprint with different perimeter. All the entrants, the materials which are composing my systems, we cannot measure that, but this is in the inventory. So we still need the part of the inventory to the decision maker for the policy. But it is for sure that in emerging country, we have a lot of uncertainty. When we arrived to look at what is the footprint or what is the measurement, we have a lot of uncertainty. So my belief is that really, because we have this experience also particularly in a big emerging country where there is already industries like Brazil, like even Morocco or Vietnam, today we are no more at the fact to do it the carbon footprint of these people. They want to jump to what action plan I can do and how I can verify this action plan, really, immediately. So we have this problem now. We are starting to make pilot project of a carbon footprint 10 years ago to talk about sustainability, which was a greenwashing, and then we are starting now to do real things, really. These people, we have to bring them to the action plan immediately if we want that in 5-10 years, 30 years, we really jump down the emissions. You know, Kenya's as well is the same problem. So I'm sure that if we arrive with a system which can be able to give rapidly minimum information on the area, and particularly in the megalopole, in the big megalopole, Africa will become, you know that I heard there was in Uganda, that Uganda there are 35 millions, and in 2030, in 15 years, there will be 70 million people. You know, it is, and most of them, they will live in the city, in the megalopole, and it is everywhere like that. So to arrive with a rapid tool, efficient tool for measurement, I think will give a baseline. It will not be completed. It will not be enough. If we look at the point of view you mentioned when the print, the real carbon footprint, totally included. But it will help to start immediately. This is my opinion.
If one wants to think about how important a measurement system for, say, carbon dioxide is, just imagine the following. Suppose we never made the Mauna Loa record. Suppose David Keeling had never begun to measure CO2 at Mauna Loa. And suppose that none of the other measurement systems that were established in the 50s, in the 60s, in the 70s, in the 80s, suppose none of that had happened. There would be no COP. There would not be an insistence that there is a problem because we would not realize that carbon dioxide was increasing in the atmosphere. People would say, oh, it's going in the oceans, it's going back in the biosphere. It's not a problem. But the Keeling record essentially established this as a problem, and that we understand it, at least at the global scale. So I'd like to turn, are there questions from the audience for the panel? Any questions at all about this topic? Yes.
Hello?
Yes, perfect.
Hi, yeah. I'm divided between which of the two exciting questions to answer, to ask. But one is that you've all sort of talked about the problem of localizing the measurement and verification. The big question that the COP is facing is how to do this worldwide. And specifically, not just from, you've been talking about kind of from the point of view of a policy decision makers within cities or regional areas. But what the COP looking at, obviously from the INDCs, is national commitments. And one of the big questions here is going to be, okay, who's going to keep these to these commitments, and who's going to verify them? So I'm kind of interested in how Harris or all of you see your systems and your capabilities fitting into the big question of keeping countries honest. How does that work? Do you see yourselves plugging into NGO systems, press systems, into national systems that look on at each other, and point fingers at each other? So I'm a little interested in that, and then maybe if there's nothing else to talk about, I would be very interested in the Mayor Applebaum's discussion a little bit about how well the tax system works, since for Boulder, since so many believe that the answer to the problem is a carbon tax, and if you think that was in fact the answer to the problem. So thank you.
Okay, I think the first question has to do with trust but verify. So how do you see this system both in Paris, but also Eric Webster, your company is engaged in production of a satellite that measures CO2 by the Japanese Space Agency, and then how does this play also with other types of technologies, and then others may want to comment. Certainly Dr. Baker, in terms of a country on the sink side of the equation, perhaps.
Right. As I kind of mentioned, it's really hard right now. You've got some satellite instruments that take certain kind of measurements in certain areas, but it's not. It's almost we're still going to rely on inventories, I think, for a while until we get that layered approach of understanding globally what the situation is to have some certain points, and then combining the systems so that you've got a global idea of what the United States is for CO2 or methane, and then you try to look at a regional aspect of that, and then again try to get to local from the standpoint of where are really the problems or issues, and how do you measure and modify that. So I think in the near term, in the next 3 to 5 years, unless there's very specific desires by agencies and governments to fund more complicated systems are coming together, they're still going to have to rely on an inventory system until we determine how best to combine the different data sets to give you some kind of piece of information that you can use on a large scale. So I think it's still going to be a challenge over the next several years. There's only 2 satellites in space right now that measure CO2, and both of them, as you know, Barian, aren't quite capable yet of providing this country's 400 parts per million and this country's 300, and we just don't have that capability yet. We don't have it with airborne, right? You'd have to fly a lot of planes, an awful lot, and we're just starting to do more of the ground measurements that have a higher fidelity. So it's going to be a challenge to do that. But if the push from the COP21 is for these types of measurements, or there's regulations or more of a international agreement, then the innovation is there. The ability to create the technologies and the software and the algorithms, those aren't the hardest problems. It's knowing what it is someone wants to measure exactly, at what resolution and in what area, and are they willing to pay for it, right? So I think if you can marry those things, I think we can have a system or systems of systems, as you said, that could do a lot of that. But without that clear direction, without that clear understanding of what those numbers or things are, and without a clear funding mechanism in a way, it makes it really hard for companies as well as federal agencies to come up with that next system.
But certainly, I think your point is well taken in that one of the things that probably is going to come out of COP is, aside from the voluntary commitments, how do we know what is really happening at the country scale? And the 2 satellites that are in orbit right now will not give you that information at the country scale. And so if we want to, in some sense, measure the emissions from France versus Germany versus Italy versus the UK versus Mexico versus the US, that's a very different measurement problem, and we are not there with the current approach. Yeah. It's going to require something different. Jim, could you comment just further about where you see, for instance, in terms of the, shall we say, the terrestrial forest initiative, how does that go to other countries? Is this something that, shall we say, goes from Kenya to Tanzania to Indonesia and other places?
Well, in the end, am I on?
Yeah.
Yep.
Yeah. In the end, we have to have an international system there where there's agreement on what the data standards are, so that each country can make sure that they're meeting the international standards. We don't have that yet for most of the land sector. The only place we have that for right now is for weather data. So we exchange weather data. The standards are set by the World Meteorological Organization, and so there's an understanding of what a country will provide, and then how that data is checked with errors and so on. And I think one of the things that one would like to see coming out of a COP is an agreement on international standards for all parts of the Earth system, not just the weather part. And I think that's something that is happening.
Okay. Other questions at all? Your second question. Yeah. Mike is right behind you.
My second question really was for Mayor Applebaum, how effective the carbon tax you feel it was in Boulder, and if you see that the plane is the answer to the entire world's problems.
Well, I do see it as the answer to the entire world's problems, but not because of what happened in Boulder. So Boulder does have a tiny, 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 tiny carbon tax, and I think we're the only place in the country that does, but it's not for the purpose of getting people to reduce their energy use. It's really for the purpose of raising some revenue to pay for our sustainability and climate goals, efforts, and there's another component of it that pays for our efforts to municipalize our electric power system. In other words, to turn it into a municipally owned power system. And our voters did support both of those. And that seems like a good way to, in fact, raise revenue whose goal is to reduce the impacts of climate change is by a very small increment on people's, in this case, electric energy usage. But it's so tiny, it is not going to have a change in the market. From my perspective, just speaking as a local official here, but thinking a little more big picture, yeah, I'm a huge fan of a carbon tax. I mean, I do think that the way we're going to get much of the outcome we need is, in fact, to let the market do it. And one of the reasons we would like to municipalize our electric power system is we're in a situation where, as many cities are around the world, certainly in the United States, where we just are assigned to a power utility, electric power utility. There's no choice, there's no competition, there's no market whatsoever. And if there were choice, if there were competition, if there were a market, given where technology is going, and if it were really a truly appropriately free market, in other words, if the cost of carbon were factored in, hence a carbon tax, there's no question whatsoever that you would see a much more rapid shift to renewable energy and a great technological advances in that arena. That is all being, I think, artificially delayed and stymied because of the system we currently have, certainly in the United States, where there's no incentive whatsoever to make those changes. In fact, it's quite the opposite. There are disincentives in the system now to make those changes. A carbon tax would, in fact, capture those environmental impacts and level that playing field, and I think really lead the market to the innovation that we're seeing, but not fast enough, and allowing us to have the choice and the competition that we need. I'm a big fan. I'm not an economist, but I think that would be the right way to go. And in our little way, in trying to municipalize our power system, we're trying to get there.
This would also be one of those things if we went to a cap and trade or we went to a carbon tax, to have a measurement system in place prior to that activity, and then to see the change in the system after the activity or after the policy. It seems to be a fundamental thing that we ought to be able to do. And that would say we ought to put the system in place now so that as actions are taken by humans, one can actually show that there is a result.
Although, again, I'll just say, in a way, not to knock measurement, because we desperately need it, but there is a common sense element here, as I said before. If you had a carbon tax, and if the percentage of our energy that came from renewables went from whatever, 20% to 40%, I don't need fancy measurements to tell me we're heading in the right direction. Now, the measurements will tell us how well we're doing and how much of a difference it's making, and is that enough of a difference? But clearly, from a policy perspective, we would now be heading in the right direction. Right. And a carbon tax would get us there, I think, way faster than the snail's pace that we're going at least in the United States.
Other questions? Yes, please. Microphone's just behind you.
Thank you. Hi, my name is Sebide Ratuber. I think the best thing is not only the carb tax, but also using a lot of existing technology that is already helping a lot of European countries to reduce CO2. the problem is that North American part, I work and live in Canada, and we have a lot of difficulties with bringing the European technology over there because everybody is afraid of taking risks and trying to find a way that it's not efficient, and then we have to go for taxes which people are not willing to pay or not happy with that. So my question is it a way to get a kind of cooperation with European countries or universities, or that you can see that there are a lot of technology that can reduce the CO2 up to 70% if you use the technology?
Comments?
Maybe as
Yeah.
a European in the table,
Yes.
I can try to answer. Of course, there is tools to cooperate with Europe and European to work on action plan and introduce technologies. One of the experience we had in Brazil, maybe in 2 words, is that we have made a cooperation between the region to region. So from north region of France, Lille, Calais. You are in France, so maybe you know better the geography since you arrived to Paris. So north of France, and the region of Minas Gerais. Minas Gerais is a state of of Brazil, is a federal state as well, and with the state of Minas Gerais. So why is this cooperation? Because it was historical between these 2 regions, which are mining region. The North French region mining are dead, and they are in the way to readapt, regenerate the soil and the employment and all the social aspect after mining. And Minas Gerais is looking at what will happen soon in that aspect, because they are at the peak of the mining, but they know they will reduce. So this was an interesting cooperation, and in that we have introduced what we call the climate plan, which is a typically French methodology which has been developed by ADEME. ADEME is the French National Environmental Agency, which have developed methodologies for years on the struggle against the climate change, and particularly the climate plan. So we have really developed a cooperation founded by partially Brazil, partially France. And today, because we arrived with this planification, when we arrive in an emerging countries, more or less there is planification, but so or some by sector, by field. The interest to use the carbon indicator is really transversal one. So we can look at wastewater, all sectors, energy, forest, and everything, agriculture. And with this plan, we can really directly arrive to a very transversal one and go to the to give priority to different sector and politically convince the head of the local authorities to go for action. And what is interesting is that when you have such planification and organized planification to present to financing organization, including World Bank, all the aid agency, they are very interesting. And so you can finance projects and you go to technology. In Minas Gerais today, after 2 years, we have now the Banco de Desarrollo, the development bank, sorry, the local development bank of the state of Minas Gerais, which is including 100 million euro now to invest in municipal project. They have first voted the plan at the level of the state, so the governor itself impose the plan as a whole plan to all the to the region. And nowadays, the financing people are coming, and they are financing low carbon technology for wastewater, for waste, etc. So that is a very interesting. We come from a cooperations, North-South cooperation, and we can include the planification, transversal one, with the carbon as a key factor. And then we can go up to the technologies and to the project on the field. So there is tools, and if you have tools and you use it correctly, finance will come.
We're probably near the end, but when we mentioned Brazil and France and cooperation, perhaps we need a Brazil and France in a competition like the World Cup. So perhaps we need a World Cup for carbon reductions. And so if we think about our soccer teams being in competition, well, why not have the same thing? Country by country, we could compete in who could lower CO2 emissions the fastest. So at least we would then have a goal like the World Cup. As we had the great competition here in France when France won the World Cup out at the football stadium, beating Brazil. Next time we should beat Brazil and beat the United States in reductions in carbon emissions. So anyway, let's thank our panel, and it's 1800 hours.